Hi everyone, and very welcome to this week's episode of Gideon Made It. Today's episode I want to show you how I made this coffee table top using cork. Now, cork is a material that I've been wanting to work with for quite a long time just because it has such lovely characteristics. It's warm to the touch, it is soft so it's easy to work with. Now that I've done it, I realize that it laminates very easily and it's just pleasant to work with. So I was very excited to do this project. For this I used a second-hand base by an Italian company called that I bought off of eBay, and I only made this little tabletop to go with it, just to get a feel for the material more than anything else. Then I left a little hole in because I stained it and people don't immediately realize what it is. It's just to show that it is natural cork if you look inside. Let's go and have a look and see at the detail of how I did it.
I built this project in May 2020 during the COVID-19 lockdowns, which meant that finding material was a little bit difficult. After speaking to two manufacturers in Portugal, both of whom were running very low on stock as factories were closed, I just decided to buy 3 sheets of 12mm cork from a supplier here in the UK and laminate it to give me a 36mm thick slab to work with. And although I could have waited to buy the correct standard thickness, I thought experimenting with its lamination was worthwhile in and of itself. The original tabletop was simply a larger repeat of the base, so I decided to stick to the simple shape that worked. All I had to do was now just work out how to fit it onto the material that I had available. For the lamination I used PVA or just normal wood glue, and I applied it thicker than I normally would do if I was working with wood, and I also applied it to both sides. So I did this because I knew that the cork is porous and expected it might have needed just a little bit more glue to compensate for any absorption. To apply it, I used a flat bit of plastic that came with my window film, and it worked much faster than a brush would. You can also use a squeegee or credit card. Any piece of flat, flexible plastic should work. To spread the pressure of the clamps evenly, I used a combination of wood I had around the workshop to clamp it, and then left it to dry overnight. The standard size for the sheets I bought was 915mm long by 610mm wide, which was just a little too narrow for the size of the top I wanted to make. Rather than reduce the size of the top to fit the material, I decided to cut a piece of the long end and add it to the width of the board. This way I could also test joining pieces of cork together. The hold of the glue is just as strong as for wood, but one thing to be aware of is not to clamp it too tightly, as the cork tends to want to buckle. I was a little bit paranoid that I would accidentally move the base when routing the cork, so I made these reference marks on there before I started any cutting, just in case. To make sure the base remained in position, I added a heavy weight, but you can also use clamps to do this. I then just took it nice and slow with a router and took 2 passes to give me a nice clean cut. Something I noticed is that because the cork is so soft, it doesn't catch in the same way that wood sometimes does. And as a router is one of the more intimidating machines for new woodworkers, I think this is a great material for people wanting to start using a router for the first time. Here you can see that the cork didn't laminate consistently across the full surface of the sheets. This is because the material is soft, so I'll need to add more clamps and cawls next time when I laminate the cork. Or even better yet, provided the piece is small enough, use a vacuum bag to apply consistent pressure across the piece. I use this method to apply linoleum in another project, and you can click on the link to see what I mean. In case I wanted to put the base back in exactly the same place for some reason, I just traced an outline with a Sharpie before removing it. To round the edges of the top, I used a large diameter router bit with a bottom guide bearing. The bit and the router I'm using here both used to belong to my late father and are a fair bit older than 20 years. I brought it over from South Africa in a suitcase when I last went over on holiday, and using some of these old tools that I used to grow up with, it just makes me smile. It also goes to show that you don't need the latest and greatest tools to get the work done. To make sure I got the right depth, I used an offcut piece and rounded the corners, as I knew that this was where the profile would be the most noticeable. With the router bit set, I then moved on to the top, and again just took my time to cut the profile on both edges carefully. Because I knew the cork is soft, I decided to start out with hand sanding the edges, but soon made the decision to move on to the orbital sander. Yes, cork is softer than wood, but at this density I was surprised just how robust it actually is. The biggest difference with sanding cork was that I could start with a finer grit and could get a very good finish for not a lot of sanding. All pluses in my book. For the joints I will next time use a router to give me a cleaner edge, but at least it gave me the opportunity to test how well cork took to filler. I mixed a little bit of cork dust from my sander with a bit of wood glue in the most unscientific of ratios and just used my finger to force it into any visible gaps. It came out very clean after sanding, but it did leave a slight line after oiling, as the glue is not as porous as the cork and therefore doesn't absorb the tinted oil in the same way as cork does. Also, when doing it again, I'll mask up everywhere but the area I'm gluing, just to save time sanding. To position the base on the top, I just eyeballed it until it looked right and used a combination of wood screws and washers to attach the base to the top. Here I was careful not to over tighten the screws, as the cork was soft and would easily strip the holes, but as with the sanding, I was quite surprised by how much more durable the cork was in fact than I expected it to be. Now, I was very curious to see how cork took to coloring through painting, staining or oiling. As I had some black Osmo oil in the workshop, I decided to see what that would look like. The cork was a lot less porous than I thought it would be, but it was porous nonetheless, which meant that it took about 3 coats of the oil to get a nice and consistent color. I used non-abrasive pads to apply the oil and kept on rubbing it until there were no wet spots left before leaving it to dry as per the coating instructions on the side of the can. I use Osmo for almost all my projects, and the trick to applying it is definitely to go as thin as possible with each layer and then repeating it with as many layers as you need to get the right finish. To get the right diameter for the hole, I used 2 pieces of wood with square edges to get the widest diameter of the glass bowl. I then narrowed the gap a little and played around with the depth the bowl would finally fit into. Measured that gap and then used that as a diameter to cut the hole in the top. For cutting circles with my router, I use this piece of polycarbonate that I bolt to my router using the same holes as the base plate. I made sure to measure the radius of the hole from the outside of my router bit to the center, and to make sure I drilled the hole as accurately as possible, I used a center punch to mark the hole before drilling a small pilot hole and then finishing it with a 6mm hole for the center axis. Making sure that I kept firm pressure on the center bolt, I carefully cut the circle using the polycarbonate as a type of compass. I decided to test the strength of my joint a little further by cutting the circle right across the joint line, thus removing roughly half of the surface area. It also made the unsightly glue line a little bit smaller. To sand the inside of a hole, the easiest is to find anything with a smaller diameter, wrap some sanding paper around it and get to work. It can be anything really, and in this case this can of Brusso did just fine. The edge of the hole still felt a little sharp and unfinished, so I cut a very slight bevel into it using the router. This left only the base to be fitted, one last wipe of the top, and the table was done.
Anyway guys, thank you very much for watching. As I said at the beginning, I really enjoyed working with this material, and it comes in so many different shapes and sizes and densities that there are so much you can do with it. So I bought a roll of cork that I would do something with in future episodes. If you want to see that, please click on the bell button so you get notifications for future episodes. Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.